name's Peter Canning. I'm a paramedic in Hartford. I've been a paramedic there since 1995. I also work as the EMS coordinator at John Dempsey Hospital. Through both jobs, I've been very involved with watching the opioid epidemic over the years, and in the last several years becoming very involved in a number of initiatives to track overdoses and to increase our efforts as far as harm reduction to try to mitigate the damages that are occurring out there. So I grew up in Simsbury. I've lived all over the country, but since 1994 I've been back in Connecticut. I also, for a number of years, I worked in the United States Senate for U.S. Senator Lowell Weicker, and I was his speechwriter when he was governor of Connecticut. When his term ended is when I decided to go and become a paramedic.
And what made you want to become a paramedic?
So when I worked in Washington and when I worked for the governor in Connecticut, I enjoyed working on policy, but I found too much of the time I was sitting in a room, and yet I wasn't really out there seeing what I was helping to legislate and the policies of it. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to go out and see things for myself on the first hand, and then use the experience that I had as someone who'd worked in government to try to make things better from the frontline perspective. So I've been able to do that while during the day I've worked in the streets. I've been able to, both through this job and through other jobs in the past and committee work, being able to affect legislative change and to get things done that help make a difference. I find when I speak before the legislature, I have some authority because I can speak not just from someone who works in a hospital or a health department, but from someone who's actually out there on the front lines touching patients.
What is your experience with the hospital and healthcare system in Hartford been overall?
I think Hartford is blessed to have such wonderful hospitals and dedicated, caring healthcare professionals. I think that there are quite a number of people who recognize the importance of being involved in their communities and who they're not in ivory towers in their hospitals, but they're out there working in the streets. So I'm proud to be among them. When I was young, I lived in the suburbs, and I would often come to work through the North End. My father would bring me into Hartford through the North End, and when I was a child, there was riots in the North Ends in the middle '60s. So it was sort of interesting to me that as a child driving through these streets that I was somewhat afraid of, that I've gone and worked most of my life in them now.
1995, you're coming on in one of the deadliest years. Talk about, first off, why you decided to go into the field at a time like that, and what that time was like.
So I began as a paramedic in Hartford in 1995. It was right in the midst of big gang wars that were going on in Hartford between the Los Solitos and the Latin Kings. The gun violence was as high as it would ever be. It's been bad lately. It's approaching those heights, but at the time there's a lot of gun violence over the drug trade, and I worked at night sometimes there, and we were constantly being called for shootings. There were drug overdoses at the time, but the drug overdoses pale in comparison to the increasing number of drug overdoses we've had over the years. I think what happened in a lot of cases with the gangs is initially they fought each other for territory, and they eventually learned that by lessening their violence they could make more money just focusing on the drug trade, because there was enough money to be made for all.
Talk about that time in regards to violence. What was it like?
While there's a lot of gun violence going on, it's still a small portion of the overall 911 types of calls. And I know some people, they get the impression that you're going out and every single call is for someone who's been shot. It's a much smaller number. But the gun violence we had people who were targeted, gang members who were shooting each other, and then unfortunately there were some cases where bystanders were hit by stray fire. It's always unfortunate when younger people have their lives ended so suddenly and needlessly.
Let's shift to talking about the drug problems back in the day. You
Yeah.
said you said something there about them switching their mindset to make more money. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So I'm trying to figure out how to say that. So it's getting a little far afield in my area of expertise. I mean, it's my observations,
Mhm.
but so when I began as a paramedic, there were a number of heroin overdoses, and there were quite a large number of shootings. Over time, the gang seemed to come to a truce, and the shootings diminished, and the drug overdoses started to gradually increase. But it wasn't until maybe the maybe 2010, 2012 or so that the drug overdoses really began to accumulate. And that was when fentanyl started to come into play in Hartford. And it went from just a little bit of fentanyl being put into the drugs to nowadays we don't even see heroin anymore. It's pretty much all fentanyl. And that has led to the increasing number of overdoses.
And what is fentanyl?
Okay, so when I began as a paramedic, the opioid overdoses were all heroin. Heroin, the drug dealers have to plant a crop, they have to harvest it, they have to hope for rain, and they have to smuggle it over the border. Now, fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. You don't need farm, you don't need weather, you don't need to raise your crop. This is a drug that can be made in a laboratory. So the benefit of it for a drug dealer is that the fentanyl is 50 times stronger than the heroin. So for the same amount of price, they can make the same amount of each drug. But since one drug is 50 times stronger, that's 50 times more profit. In addition, it's 50 times smaller as far as smuggling it. Now the danger and the reason that people are dying is a bag of fentanyl versus a bag of heroin. If fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin, it doesn't mean that you need 50 bags of heroin to equal the fentanyl. It means there's that much less active ingredient. Where a bag of fentanyl, a bag of heroin might be 50% active ingredient, a bag of fentanyl is only 1 or 2% active ingredient. And the problem there comes with the mixing. If this was mixed in a pharmacy, you could ensure that every bag had the exact same of active ingredient, in which case nobody would overdose because they would know what their tolerance was. The problem with it, and also fentanyl tends to clump, which makes it even harder. So that every time somebody uses fentanyl, they might not be getting any fentanyl, they might be getting the 2%, which would be the standard dose, or they could be getting 20%, which will kill them if they use alone. So what I found that today, the reason that people die from overdoses is that they use alone, and if they overdose and no one finds them, by the time we get there, it's often too late. And the reason that they overdose is because of the fentanyl, because no one can tell the dose that they're getting. So if we could find a way to keep people from using alone, and we could find a way to ensure that the dosing was accurate, many of these deaths would not be happening.
I want to talk about something else that we were speaking of. Talk me through your mindset again on when you first started and,
Sure.
and you were seeing them use to now.
When I was a new paramedic in 1995, and I did a heroin overdose, I thought that the person who overdosed had a character flaw. I would say to them, "What's wrong with you? Why are you trying to kill yourself? You're going to end up dead or in jail. So just say no." Over time, and particularly as the overdoses began to increase, I started to try to find out why this was happening. And I learned, both through science, learning about addiction, something that's very rarely taught to paramedics, and until recently was hardly taught to doctors at all, that addiction is a disease, and that many of these people who got into, they didn't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to be a heroin addict. They got into a car accident, they broke their back, they were injured in sports, they had a disease, they had a tumor or something, and they were put on high-dose opioids through their own doctors. And in time, what happened to many of them is they became addicted to them. Some people are more genetically disposed than others. And what happens with these drugs is that they can change somebody's brain chemistry. And in time, particularly what happens is a doctor might cut somebody off after 6 months of these pills, by which time they're already addicted. So they're horribly sick, going through withdrawal. So what many of them do is they buy the pills on the street. A 30 milligram oxycodone costs $30. That's pretty expensive. So in time, in order to stay from being sick, people are running out of money. The same person who can sell them the oxycodone can sell them heroin. Heroin is basically the same product, except it's much cheaper and much more readily available. So it's a very easy switch for somebody, particularly since in this area the heroin is powdered. So for someone to use heroin for the first time, they don't have to tie a belt around their arm and stick a needle into their arm. They can just sniff it through the nose. As time goes by and their tolerance increases, many of them switch to IV use. But when I do these overdoses, I talk to the people, and many of them say, I used to be a normal person once. Then they got injured, they got the high dose prescription, they became addicted, and then they were cut off and cast out. And when you think of these people and the stories that they tell, you wonder what would have happened. This girl who was once a cheerleader who broke her back is now overdosing in an alley. Or the soldier who volunteered after 9/11 to go fight in the war and was shot, came home with a Purple Heart and a terrible addiction. What would his life have been like if he hadn't enlisted in the war, if he hadn't been shot? But instead, these are the trajectories that they were sent upon. And in many cases, it could be any of us. If our car got hit, broadsided at an intersection, we had a bad, a back injury, and we were set down on this path by our own physicians. So I came to learn that addiction is a medical disease. And in many cases, you can take people and you can put them in an MRI, and you can see the damage that the disease has caused their brain, in the same way you can see the damage to somebody's heart or to somebody's lungs. So to expect somebody with an opioid addiction to act rationally all the time is akin to expecting somebody with a broken leg to run a 100-yard dash, or someone with COPD to climb Mount Everest. We have to recognize that this is a public health problem, and law enforcement and locking people up is not going to save their lives. In fact, the problem with law and the stigma against opioid use drives people into the shadows. It causes them to shoot up behind dumpsters and behind locked bedroom doors. And when we find them, often it's too late. A number of years ago, I first learned the term harm reduction. What harm reduction is, it's a set of principles that basically says people are going to use drugs. And rather than condemning them, what we need to do is to help them use safely until such a time that they're ready for treatment. Harm reduction recognizes that dead people don't recover. Harm reduction treats people as fellow human beings. It talks to them with straight languages, and it recognizes their humanity. Harm reduction includes needle exchange, naloxone, and it even includes things such as safe injection sites. And a benefit of this, let me talk about this. In the city of Hartford, there are a lot of public consumption sites where people use. One might be your local McDonald's or your Subway. They go into the bathroom, they lock the door. Half an hour later, somebody tries to use the bathroom and they can't get in, it's locked. The manager finally opens it up and there's somebody dead behind that door. Wouldn't it be better if that person, rather than using in a public laboratory, was using in a safe space where a medical person could be there watching them, or someone with used experience? someone who can talk to them, ask them how they're doing, can refer them to health care, and if they're ready for treatment, can help get them into treatment. So Mark's organization does stuff like that. Law and stigma drive people into the shadows, and that's where they die. We don't want to drive people away. We want to bring them out into the open. We want to bring them into a healthcare environment and treat them as humans, as members of our community, because they are. There are sisters, brothers, fathers, uncles, mothers, next door neighbors, all people who at one point or another in their life suffered something that caused them to go down a path that they could not have foreseen. So when someone suffers an opioid overdose, the true danger of it is that the opioid can cause them to shut down their breathing. So if they stop breathing, they suffer hypoxia, and then hypoxia stops their heart. Once their heart has stopped, it's very difficult to get them back. What naloxone does is, when you give it to somebody, it knocks the opioid off the receptors in the brain that are shutting down the breathing and enable them to breathe again on their own in an adequate way. So it's very important that when somebody overdoses, they get naloxone within a certain length of time. When I began as a paramedic, only paramedics could administer it. Over time, we were able to successfully change the laws so that EMTs and first responders, such as police and fire, could administer it if they got there first, and lay people could administer it. So what I find now, where before I would show up and the person would not be breathing, now often I arrive and the person has already received naloxone from a bystander and they're up and breathing. Many times, in fact, I've shown up on scenes and found Mark and other members of the Harm Reduction Coalition there with the person. They've helped revive them, and they're also there once they've been revived to talk to them, to offer them, opportunities to get into treatment. So it's a wonderful drug, and it's over the years more and more bystanders are carrying it now, and it's really very helpful in preventing death. The limitation of naloxone is that it just prevents somebody from dying once they've had an overdose. It doesn't prevent the overdose in the first place, and that's an area that we really need to focus on.
You've been talking about the epidemic, but can you just tell us what is an opioid epidemic?
So, opioid is drugs such as morphine is an opioid, heroin is an opioid, and fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. The opioid epidemic that we have has gone through 3 waves. The first wave was prescription pills. Quite a number of years ago, the pharmaceutical companies started aggressively pushing prescription opioids on doctors to have them liberally prescribe them to the patients. At the time, they said that the chance of addiction was very low, that people could not develop tolerance to them, and people would not really particularly get high on them. All of that was false. That caused quite a number of overdose deaths. What people would do once they became addicted is they would take those pills and they would shave those pills down to powder, and they would snort them or they would inject them. In an effort to counter that, the pharmaceutical companies came up with a drug-resistant, a tamper-resistant oxycodone. Now, the unintended consequence of that was where people could no longer turn it into powder or inject it, they turned instead to heroin, which was sold by the same people who were selling them the pills. So from 2010, when those tamper-resistant pills came out, we saw a sudden increase in heroin. And then that led, the heroin was the second wave. The third wave, and the most deadly wave, has been the fentanyl. And what's interesting is that the fentanyl was not driven by the consumer. The people using it didn't say, hey, we don't want heroin anymore, give us this fentanyl. The drug dealers switched to fentanyl because it was so much more economically profitable. When you use fentanyl, it doesn't last as long as heroin, so people have to use it more often. And as I've said before, the real danger with fentanyl is that the dose is extremely hard to control. So people are dying because they can't judge the dose that they're getting.
How do you think that overall it's impacted Hartford?
Hartford has been particularly hard hit. Um, Hartford is somewhat of the mecca. A lot of people come to Hartford to buy their drugs. So we see people overdosing, not just Hartford residents, but people who have driven here. We see a lot of overdoses in cars. There's quite a number of car accidents where someone who's in withdrawal, they drive into Hartford, they buy the drugs, they inject and try to drive off, and they overdose and crash. What I'm very concerned with in the last couple of years is we have seen an increase in the number of deaths in the minority population in the cities, in the black and Hispanic. Much of the opioid epidemic, the focus that we've seen nationwide, has come because people who have access to power, largely white people, have been able to draw the focus on it because their sons and daughters are dying. Where years ago when I started in the city, much of it was minority people, and the larger society didn't care. We are seeing a trend again now that the minority areas are beginning to really suffer, and it's important that the resources be directed there to help them, because we're really all members of one community.
How many overdose reversals have you been involved with?
I would say probably thousands. I've been doing this for over 25 years. Now I work in a fly car, so I'm basically the first one at many scenes. So pretty much every day I work, I do at least one overdose. I've had other days where I've done 3 or 4 within a day. Recently I've had a number of cases of multiple overdoses. What's happening now is the fentanyl is contaminating the cocaine supply. A dealer may sell fentanyl and sell cocaine, and they use the same equipment to blend it and to grind it and to package it. And if they don't use super sterile methods, the fentanyl can contaminate the cocaine. So we see a lot of overdoses where a group of people might buy some cocaine, they think they're going to have a good time, they snort the cocaine, and unknown to them and also unknown to the dealer, that cocaine has been contaminated by fentanyl. And these people have no tolerance at all to an opioid overdose, and they get revived with naloxone if we get there in time. Unfortunately, I've been at some where we haven't been able to save everybody. So
you were talking about how Hartford, people are coming into Hartford to get the drug. Why does Hartford have it so bad? Why is it so big here in Hartford, do you think?
So Hartford is a mecca for drugs. It's because we're at an intersection of the highways of 91 and 84. So a lot of the drugs come in up to Hartford. Some come up from the 95 corridor and then up from New Haven into Hartford. But a lot of people come down from Vermont and New Hampshire through 91 to get it. We also see people coming up from the shorelines. But if you look at maps of where overdoses occur and where most of the drug problems are, it's right along the highways. And Hartford, just geographically being in between Boston and New York and being the gateway up to Vermont and New Hampshire, tends to draw a lot.
What does fentanyl look like?
Okay, so fentanyl is a white powder that's indistinguishable from white heroin. When a dealer packages a bag of fentanyl, which can go for $3 or $4 on the street, he combines fentanyl with things such as sugars, baking soda, baby formula. It's very hard to tell what's what, but it's a white powder. That's why many people may think that they're doing cocaine when in fact that they're doing fentanyl. Because of the way the powder is, you can't tell what in the bag you have is baby formula and what's fentanyl. There's no way for someone to gauge how much fentanyl's in there. There's fentanyl test strips that they can tell you that fentanyl is present, but they can't tell you the amount of fentanyl. And that's the real problem. So when somebody does a bag of fentanyl, it's truly a Russian roulette. they don't know the content. It could be no fentanyl, it could be 2% fentanyl, or it could be 20% fentanyl, which would be a fatal dose. One of the things that's happened with fentanyl is that dealers are now taking the fentanyl the powder, and they're pressing it into counterfeit pills. So the pills look like a regular oxycodone, but in fact they're just fentanyl and powder. Now the DEA has estimated that I believe something like 3 out of every 10 pills may contain a lethal dose. It's just all in how things are mixed. And again, there's no way for some to judge. If these pills were done in a pharmaceutical company, every pill would have the exact same amount. But since these are not being processed that way, every pill is a game of Russian roulette.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe what it's like knowing that large companies like Purdue Pharma and Pfizer that are headquartered in Connecticut, which is one of the richest states in the nation, have profited from an epidemic that is killing people literally 60 miles away?
I wish that the people who sat in the boardrooms of pharmaceutical companies could come out and ride with me and see the effects of the decisions that they made that may have been good for their profits, but that were catastrophic for our communities.
How do you think that physical, mental, and emotional health have played into substance use?
So, unrecognized to many people is the role that mental health plays in someone's addiction. What happens sometimes is a person who may have undiagnosed depression or be suffering from some type of childhood trauma, they may get hurt and then prescribed opioids. And then when they take those opioids for the first time, that pill suddenly makes them feel whole for the first time because it's actually treating their depression. And for many people, once their injury is gone, that pill is important to them in order to their sense of well-being. And then when they get shut off, by then it's sort of too late. I think it's important to understand that drugs work for many people. That's why they use them. And rather than banning drugs, the war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure. What we need to do is ensure that for certain people, that if they're going to use drugs, that they have an access to a safe supply of the drugs. And right now, the problem is that drug supply is poisoned. It's not safe, and it's causing massive deaths.
Do you think that COVID-19 has had a significant impact?
Yes. COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the opioid epidemic and on the number of deaths. Because of COVID, people have been driven into isolation. And isolation is the opposite of community. So when people are isolated and they're alone, they're not getting help from other people, and they're also using alone more often. And as I said, when you use alone with a contaminated drug supply, that's when people die.
How has COVID-19 really affected your work?
COVID-19 has made the work of a paramedic much harder. I find that having to gown up, I put on a body length gown, and I'm 6'8". It doesn't fit me. A lot of times my arms will burst through the gown. We have to wear a face shield, a mask, a tight N95. The face shield fogs up. It's hard to hear through the mask. It's hard to hear your patient. It's just exhausting. And at the end of the call, then to have to, doff your stuff and re-clean all your stuff makes it very tiring. It's also just through the course of the epidemic, wondering every time you feel a body ache or every time you have a sniffle or a cough, do you have COVID? What's going to happen to you when you go home at the end of the day? You have to, strip in the garage and make certain that you're not bringing the disease into your family.
What do you think about the public response from really local, state, and federal officials
To COVID?
Mm-hmm.
I think Connecticut has been one of the leaders in the nation as far as how they've handled the COVID epidemic. I mean, I don't envy the leaders trying to walk the line between protecting the larger public health and protecting, somebody's individual sort of rights to live. I think that they've done a very good job among, it's not that we all know the information, it's the science keeps changing, but I think they've done a good job here. I don't envy them.
Do you think that COVID-19 has had an impact on the violence as well that's been going on in the city?
I do think that COVID-19 has had something to do with the violence. I think it has just disrupted our normal state, and people don't know who to trust or what to trust anymore. They don't know if they're going to be alive a few years from now. They don't know what life will be like. They don't know if they'll have jobs. They don't know anything, and that sort of creates an internal chaos. It's very disruptive to people's mental health, and I think that can lead people to violence.
What have the last 2 years been like for you?
The last 2 years have been very difficult. The combination of the increasing number of deaths we've seen with opioids, the rising violence, the turmoil caused by COVID, it has a personal effect on you that you just nobody really knows what to expect anymore. I mean, you still put on your boots in the morning and you go to work, but it's been very hard not having a stability to things.
How do you think that the recent fatal overdose of the 13-year-old at the Hartford Public School has affected Hartford and you?
So the overdose of the 13-year-old at the Hartford Public School was a terribly tragic event. If there's anything to come out of it, when a young person dies, it causes a community to have self-reflection. And if something comes out of it, it's hopeful that the city will really focus and dedicate itself to this epidemic. One thing I could say is that overdoses in that age of a child is very rare. Most of the overdoses that we see in the city are in a much older age group.
How do you think we can prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening?
The number one thing that I think we need to do is to end the war on drugs. The war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure. We've spent billions and billions of dollars, we've locked up enormous numbers of people, and yet the drugs on the street now are more plentiful and more dangerous than ever. I truly think that we need to consider things such as decriminalization, such as establishment of a safe, regulated supply of drugs, and consider things such as safe injection sites. We need to improve the education. We have to, number one of all, we have to end the stigma. If people stop looking at people who use drugs as criminals and start looking at them as patients who have a disease, who have issues that we need to deal with out in the open as members of the community. And if we can bring everyone together and in the light rather than in the shadows, I think we can begin to make a dent in this.
What do you think about the city's response so far?
So I'm encouraged that the city seems to be recommitting to its opioid task force, which includes members of the harm reduction community and the health department, the local health department. And I think by putting a priority on that task force work, I think only good can come from it.
How would you describe Hartford, economically, socially, and culturally? Like what comes to mind when you think about the city?
I think the city is a wonderful place. It has great communities. As a paramedic, I love the wide variety of foods that the city has. You know, Jamaican, Puerto Rican, Brazilian. There's an enormous number of places that I can eat, and I can just pop in and get wonderful food. Vietnamese food, there's great stuff here. There's so much rich diversity on Albany Avenue and on Park Street. I really love the city. I love the murals. The Hartford has some great murals, and the communities are great. I just would like to see that the city gets recognized for that, and that we focus on the problems of the city are the problems of the state. And if we can put more of our resources into helping the cities, rather than, in Connecticut we have home rule. So we have, there are some towns where they're quite wealthy towns, and they keep their money within that town, and it doesn't go to the city. I feel terrible for the students in Hartford, and that they don't have the same educational opportunity that many people in the suburbs do have.
What's your biggest hope for the field of harm reduction?
My biggest hope for harm reduction is that everybody learns what it means, and that they understand that harm reduction is about loving people. It's not about castigating people. It's about welcoming people in, treating them as your equal, and trying to help them through their individual journeys.
You talked a little bit about this, but who are your allies in your line of work?
When I began in EMS, we had no education in addiction, no education in mental health, no education at all in, you know, harm reduction or in our communities. We were basically told there's a 911 call, you go, you take that patient, you treat him and take him to the hospital. What I would like to see, and what I'm starting to see now, is that EMS becomes a part of the community rather than a service that just responds to calls. So that, you know, every paramedic should know the local health department. They should know people in harm reduction, such as I know Mark. They should know the local restaurants. That it's very important that EMS, police, and fire be a part of the community and work together with those communities to help the people in the community.
Who are your heroes in life and in work?
So my biggest hero right now is Mark Jenkins. He's a man who, when I first saw him at a conference, I said, that man is speaking the truth. He's not worrying about who he's upsetting. He's just saying it as it is. And I've come to know Mark through conferences, through being at his harm reduction center, and I see him out on the street. I see him and the people he works with at Overdoses, and I know I have nothing but respect for him. He's doing the people's work.
All right, we're almost done here. Yeah. What's one bright moment on the job that you reflect on when things get hard?
I guess for me, what I'm starting to see more of is, in the past, when I would bring a patient who overdosed into a hospital, a nurse might roll their eyes when I said that this is a person with a fentanyl overdose, that people would be treated, you know, poorly there. And while I cannot say that every patient that goes into a hospital is treated that way, I have seen lately an increasing number of doctors and nurses recognize these people's humanities. And when they've come in, they've talked to them warmly, they've offered them help, and they haven't been judgmental. And as I see that more and more, I have more and more hope for the future that we will recognize the danger that stigma has done and recognize the value of love.
All right, I think that's it.
All right, good. Thanks.
I think that is it. Thank you.
Sure.